On a warm Sunday afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Atlanta, Mrs. Johnson was driving home from church with her 3 children. The familiar streets lined with maple trees offered no hint of how this ordinary day would become a turning point in their lives. Her youngest daughter hummed along to gospel music playing softly on the radio while her teenage sons discussed their upcoming basketball game in the back seat. As they approached the intersection near their home, Mrs. Johnson noticed a police cruiser following closely behind her silver minivan. She maintained her usual careful driving, having learned from her father years ago to be extra vigilant when law enforcement was nearby. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed on. Confused but composed, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning her vehicle exactly as she had taught her sons to do. What happened in the next 15 minutes would shake their family's sense of security and ignite a movement in their community. As Mrs. Johnson reached for her license and registration, 2 officers approached her vehicle with an unusual aggression that immediately set off alarm bells. Her children fell silent, the earlier joy of their church service replaced by growing tension. "Get out of the vehicle now," the first officer demanded, his hand already on his weapon. Mrs. Johnson, a respected elementary school teacher of 20 years, remained calm for her children's sake. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, "Officer, my license and registration are right here. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Instead of answering, the second officer yanked her door open. The children watched in horror as their mother was forcibly pulled from the driver's seat. Her oldest son instinctively reached for his phone, his hands shaking as he began recording, another lesson their mother had taught them, though she had hoped they'd never need to use it. Mrs. Johnson found herself pushed against her own vehicle, her church dress getting caught on the side mirror, as her children's frightened cries filled the air. "Please," she said, maintaining her dignity even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, "my children are watching." The officers ignored her words, their actions becoming increasingly aggressive despite her complete compliance. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Carter, who lived across the street and had known the Johnson family for years, immediately started live-streaming the incident. Other community members gathered, their presence serving as silent witnesses to the unfolding injustice. The officers claimed they had stopped her for running a stop sign that didn't exist at that intersection. When Mrs. Johnson tried to explain this fact, they twisted her arms behind her back more forcefully. Her youngest daughter's sobs from the back seat pierced the air, a sound that would haunt everyone present for long after. What the officers didn't know was that Mrs. Johnson served on the local police oversight committee, working to build bridges between law enforcement and the community. She had spent years advocating for better training and accountability measures, always believing that positive change was possible through dialogue and understanding. As more neighbors gathered, phones recording, the situation took an unexpected turn. A senior officer from the same precinct happened to be driving by and recognized Mrs. Johnson from their community outreach meetings. He quickly pulled over, his presence introducing a new dynamic to the increasingly tense situation. The day's events would spark a series of changes in the community, but not in the way anyone might have expected. This wasn't just another incident to be filed away and forgotten. Instead, it would become a catalyst for meaningful dialogue and systemic change, though the path forward would prove challenging and complex. Mrs. Johnson's story wasn't just about one afternoon gone wrong, it was about a community's response to injustice, the power of documentation in the digital age, and the ongoing struggle to ensure equal treatment under the law. As the situation continued to unfold, it would test not only Mrs. Johnson's resilience but also her long-held belief in the possibility of positive change through peaceful advocacy. The events of that Sunday afternoon would ripple through their community, touching lives far beyond those directly involved. It would raise difficult questions about power, accountability, and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. But most importantly, it would demonstrate the strength of a mother protecting her children, and the power of a community standing together in the face of injustice. Within hours of the incident, cell phone videos from multiple angles spread across social media platforms. The sight of a respected teacher being mistreated in front of her children struck a deep chord within the community. Mrs. Carter's live stream had been viewed over 50,000 times by sunset, and local news stations were already reaching out for interviews. The senior officer who had arrived at the scene, Lieutenant Thompson, had immediately ordered the two officers to release Mrs. Johnson. As she gathered her shaken children in her arms, neighbors surrounded them in a protective circle of support. Someone brought water, another offered a chair, and Mrs. Carter wrapped a comforting arm around the youngest child who couldn't stop trembling. That evening, the Johnson family's living room became an impromptu command center. Community leaders, fellow teachers, and civil rights advocates gathered to discuss their response. Mrs. Johnson's oldest son's video footage provided clear evidence of the officer's misconduct, while neighborhood security cameras had captured additional angles of the encounter. "We're not letting this get swept under the rug," declared Reverend Williams, who had baptized all 3 Johnson children. "But we're going to handle this the right way." He looked at Mrs. Johnson, who sat surrounded by her children on their familiar blue couch, her quiet dignity unchanged despite the day's events. The next morning, as Mrs. Johnson prepared to teach her 4th grade class, parents of her students organized a support rally outside the school. Many had their own stories of similar encounters, but Mrs. Johnson's case was different. Her impeccable reputation, the clear video evidence, and her role in community police relations made this incident impossible to ignore or dismiss. Local news crews arrived at the school, drawn by the growing crowd of peaceful supporters. Mrs. Johnson's principal stood firmly by her side, providing a statement that highlighted her 15 years of dedication to the school and her tireless work in building community relationships. The contrast between her known character and the officer's treatment of her became a powerful narrative that couldn't be ignored. By midday, the police department issued a preliminary statement announcing that both officers had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Lieutenant Thompson had filed his own detailed report of what he witnessed, breaking the usual code of silence. His report included a crucial detail: the database check on Mrs. Johnson's license plate had been run before the alleged traffic violation, suggesting racial profiling. The Johnson children stayed home from school that day, processing their trauma with the help of community counselors who volunteered their services. The youngest drew pictures of her mother as a superhero, while the older boys worked with tech-savvy neighbors to organize and secure all video evidence on multiple platforms. As evening approached, Mrs. Johnson received an unexpected call from the police chief himself. The conversation was brief but significant. He requested a meeting, not at the station, but on neutral ground at the community center where Mrs. Johnson had hosted numerous police community dialogue sessions over the years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very programs Mrs. Johnson had helped establish to prevent such incidents were now being activated in response to her own case. Her years of building bridges, maintaining documentation, and fostering relationships had created a foundation that would prove crucial in the days ahead. Word spread beyond their immediate community. Civil rights organizations offered support, but Mrs. Johnson remained committed to handling this through the channels she had helped create. "We built these pathways for a reason," she told her concerned supporters. "Now we'll see if they work." That night, as Mrs. Johnson helped her daughter with homework just like any other evening, her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. Other teachers shared how they had discussed the incident in their classrooms, using it as a lesson in civic responsibility and peaceful advocacy. Parents called to say their children had asked to write letters of support for their favorite teacher. The incident had sparked something larger than just another case of police misconduct. It had become a test case for the very systems of accountability and community engagement that Mrs. Johnson had spent years helping to establish. Her dual role as both victim and advocate created a unique opportunity for meaningful change. As she tucked her youngest into bed that night, her daughter asked a question that would shape their approach moving forward: "Mommy, are you going to stop helping make things better because of what happened?" Mrs. Johnson smoothed her daughter's hair and smiled softly. "No, baby. This is exactly why we need to keep working to make things better. But this time, we've got our whole community working together." The next day would bring new challenges and opportunities, but for now, Mrs. Johnson focused on being present for her children, knowing that their healing and security needed to come first. The community had mobilized, the mechanisms for accountability were in motion, and the path forward, though challenging, was clear. The story was far from over, but already it was becoming clear that this incident would be different. The seeds of change that Mrs. Johnson had planted through years of community work were finally beginning to sprout, nurtured by the very crisis that threatened to break her family's spirit. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the downtown law office as Mrs. Johnson sat across from Attorney Richardson, a civil rights lawyer with 30 years of experience. Spread across his desk were printed screenshots from the viral videos, witness statements, and the preliminary police report. Her youngest child's drawing of her as a superhero was carefully tucked into her purse, a reminder of why this fight mattered. "They ran your plates before they even claimed to see a traffic violation," Attorney Richardson noted, highlighting a timestamp on the police database report. Lieutenant Thompson's statement confirms it. "This isn't just about what happened during the stop, it's about why they targeted you in the first place." The internal affairs investigation had begun 3 days after the incident. What made this case different was the mountain of evidence: multiple video angles from neighbors, Mrs. Carter's live stream, security footage from nearby homes, and most importantly, Lieutenant Thompson's detailed testimony breaking the blue wall of silence. Mrs. Johnson's oldest son had created a secure digital folder containing every piece of evidence, organized chronologically. His computer science teacher had helped him properly back up everything and create a chain of custody document, skills from a cybersecurity workshop that now proved unexpectedly valuable. The police chief's meeting at the community center had been tense but productive. Seated at the same table where Mrs. Johnson had led dozens of community police dialogue sessions, he listened as she recounted the incident, her voice steady despite reliving the trauma. Her children's terrified faces still haunted her dreams, but she channeled that pain into purpose. "We found no stop sign at that intersection," the chief admitted, reviewing the traffic department's official documentation. "And no history of one ever being there." This simple fact undermined the entire basis for the stop, opening the door for a deeper investigation into the officer's motives. The department's Internal Affairs Division interviewed every witness, starting with Mrs. Carter from across the street. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of a routine traffic stop escalating into an abuse of power. "I've known Mrs. Johnson for 12 years, she stated firmly. "She's the kind of neighbor who brings soup when you're sick and watches your pets when you're away." The way those officers treated her, it wasn't just wrong, it was personal. Lieutenant Thompson's decision to come forward had created ripples through the department. His detailed account of arriving at the scene and recognizing Mrs. Johnson from community outreach meetings added another layer of credibility to her case. His report specifically noted the officers' aggressive behavior and their failure to follow standard procedures. The investigation uncovered more troubling details. Both officers had previous complaints filed against them, though none had resulted in serious disciplinary action. The dashboard camera from their patrol car, which should have been active, had mysteriously malfunctioned just before the stop. This convenient technical failure raised red flags with Internal Affairs. Mrs. Johnson's role on the Police Oversight Committee provided unique insight into department policies and procedures. She knew exactly which protocols had been violated, which reports should have been filed, and what questions needed to be asked. Her knowledge made it harder for anyone to dismiss or minimize the incident. The children's school principal had submitted a powerful statement describing Mrs. Johnson's character and her impact on the community. "In 15 years of teaching, she's never missed a parent-teacher conference, never turned away a struggling student, and never stopped believing in the power of education to bridge divides," the principal wrote. The trauma these officers inflicted extends beyond one family, it touches every life Mrs. Johnson has positively influenced. Local media covered the investigation with unusual thoroughness, partly due to Mrs. Johnson's reputation and partly due to the community's sustained interest. Her story had struck a chord that resonated beyond the usual news cycle. Each development was followed by thoughtful discussions in homes, schools, and churches across the city. The officer's body camera footage, when finally released, showed clear discrepancies between their verbal commands and Mrs. Johnson's actual compliance. Every "stop resisting" was met with video evidence of her careful cooperation. The footage also captured their conversation before approaching her vehicle, including comments that suggested racial bias. As the investigation progressed, Mrs. Johnson continued teaching her fourth-grade class with characteristic dedication. Her students, aware of the situation through their parents and the media, showed their support in touching ways. They wrote poems about justice, drew pictures of community helpers, and practiced using their voices to stand up for what's right. The police union initially moved to defend the officers, but the weight of evidence and community pressure led them to take a more measured approach. Internal Affairs recommended termination for both officers, citing multiple policy violations and evidence of discriminatory intent. This recommendation would go to the police chief and civilian review board for final decision. Through it all, Mrs. Johnson maintained her commitment to systemic change. "This isn't about revenge," she explained to her children over dinner. "It's about making sure no other family has to go through what we experienced." Her youngest nodded solemnly, adding another superhero cape to the drawing of her mother. As the investigation phase neared its conclusion, the groundwork was laid for legal proceedings that would test the accountability measures Mrs. Johnson had helped establish. Her case was becoming a benchmark for how departments handle misconduct allegations, particularly when the victim is a respected community leader. The story had evolved beyond a simple case of police misconduct. It had become a test of the systems designed to protect citizens, the power of community solidarity, and the importance of documentation in the digital age. As Mrs. Johnson prepared for the next phase, she knew that each step forward was paving the way for future generations. The city council chambers had never been so packed. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, many wearing blue ribbons that had become a symbol of solidarity with the Johnson family. Mrs. Johnson sat in the front row, surrounded by her children and closest supporters, as the Civilian Review Board prepared to hear her case. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. This wasn't just another disciplinary hearing, it represented a crucial test of the oversight system Mrs. Johnson had helped create. Her youngest daughter clutched her favorite stuffed animal, a constant companion since the incident, while her sons sat tall and alert, their phones ready to document every moment. The hearing began with video presentations. Seeing the incident played on the large screen made many in the audience gasp, even though most had watched it countless times on social media. Mrs. Johnson's children held hands tightly as they relived that Sunday afternoon, their mother's grace under pressure even more apparent in the enhanced footage. Lieutenant Thompson's testimony proved pivotal. He spoke with quiet authority about arriving at the scene and recognizing the disconnect between the officer's aggressive behavior and Mrs. Johnson's known character. "In my 23 years of service," he stated, "I've never seen a routine traffic stop escalated so unnecessarily, especially against someone known for building bridges between police and community." Mrs. Carter's live stream had captured crucial moments the body cameras missed, including bystanders' real-time reactions and the officer's dismissive responses to neighbors identifying Mrs. Johnson as a community leader. The Civilian Review Board paid special attention to these details, noting how they demonstrated a pattern of disregard for community relations. When Mrs. Johnson finally took the stand, her testimony focused not on anger but on opportunity for change. She spoke about her years working on the Police Oversight Committee, the progress made, and the work still needed. "This incident happened to me," she said, her voice clear and steady, "but it could have happened to any mother in our community. The difference is, I had the tools, knowledge, and support to seek justice. Her eldest son's testimony brought many to tears as he described the helplessness of watching his mother being mistreated. I started recording because she taught us to document everything, he explained. But I never thought I'd have to use those skills to protect my own mom. His younger brother added how the incident had changed their view of safety and authority. The police chief's testimony acknowledged systemic issues within the department. He outlined specific policy changes already implemented in response to the incident, including enhanced bias training and stricter protocols for traffic stops. The board noted that these changes, while positive, wouldn't have happened without the overwhelming evidence and community pressure in Mrs. Johnson's case. Outside the chambers, supporters organized a peaceful gathering. Teachers from Mrs. Johnson's school had arranged classroom coverage to attend, joining parents, students, and community members in a show of solidarity. They shared stories of Mrs. Johnson's impact on their lives, from helping struggling students succeed to organizing multicultural community events. Local news coverage highlighted how this case differed from similar incidents. The reporter noted Mrs. Johnson's unique position as both victim and advocate, her years of building relationships within the system she now challenged, and the overwhelming community response that crossed racial and social lines. During breaks in the hearing, Mrs. Johnson's fourth-grade students sent messages of encouragement through their parents. One child's note read, "Mrs. Johnson teaches us to be brave and stand up for what's right. Now she's showing us how." These simple words captured the essence of why this case resonated so deeply with the community. The two officers, appearing before the board with their union representatives, struggled to justify their actions. The timestamp evidence showing they ran her plates before any alleged violation proved particularly damaging to their credibility. Their body camera footage, showing clear contradictions between their commands and Mrs. Johnson's actual behavior, left little room for defense. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that this case would set precedents for police accountability in the region. Other departments sent observers, recognizing that the outcome would influence their own policies and procedures. Civil rights organizations documented every detail, preparing to use this case as a model for future reform efforts. Mrs. Johnson's youngest daughter, who had been quiet throughout most of the proceedings, suddenly spoke up during a break. "Mommy," she said loud enough for nearby board members to hear, "are they going to say sorry for making you cry?" The simple question cut through the legal proceedings to the human heart of the matter. The hearing's impact extended beyond the immediate case. Community members began sharing similar experiences, many for the first time. The Civilian Review Board noted a significant increase in incident reporting, suggesting that Mrs. Johnson's case had given others the courage to come forward. The police union's stance evolved throughout the hearing. Initially defensive, they gradually shifted toward acknowledging the need for reform, particularly in community relations and bias training. This shift reflected broader changes in departmental culture sparked by the incident. As the final day of hearings approached, Mrs. Johnson gathered her family for dinner at home. Over their favorite meal, they discussed how their lives had changed since that Sunday afternoon. Her children spoke about feeling stronger as a family, about learning to turn fear into action, and about seeing their mother's teaching extend far beyond the classroom. The case had become more than a disciplinary matter, it was now a catalyst for systemic change. Mrs. Johnson's dual role as educator and advocate had transformed a potentially traumatic incident into a powerful teaching moment for the entire community. As the board prepared to deliberate, the impact of their decision would reach far beyond the fate of two officers. The morning the Civilian Review Board announced their decision, the community center buzzed with anticipation. People gathered early, sharing coffee and conversation, their blue ribbons still pinned proudly to their clothes. Mrs. Johnson arrived with her family, touched to see many of her current and former students among the crowd, their parents having brought them to witness this important moment. The board's decision was unanimous. Both officers would be terminated, with the incident permanently marked in their records. More significantly, the board mandated comprehensive departmental reforms, many based on proposals Mrs. Johnson had helped develop years earlier through the Oversight Committee. The decision represented not just accountability for one incident, but a commitment to lasting change. "This outcome isn't about punishment," Mrs. Johnson told reporters afterward, her children standing proud beside her. "It's about transformation. It's about making sure other families don't have to go through what we experienced." Her words carried extra weight as she stood in the same community center where she'd spent countless hours building bridges between police and residents. The police chief took the unprecedented step of making a public apology to the Johnson family. More importantly, he announced immediate policy changes, mandatory community engagement training, revised traffic stop protocols, and enhanced oversight measures. Lieutenant Thompson would lead these new initiatives, his courage in speaking up making him an ideal champion for reform. Mrs. Johnson's fourth-grade classroom became a microcosm of community healing. Her students, who had watched their teacher face injustice with dignity, learned powerful lessons about civic engagement and peaceful advocacy. They started a Community Heroes project, interviewing local leaders about positive changes in their neighborhood. The story's impact rippled outward. Other police departments across the state began reviewing their own policies, using Mrs. Johnson's case as a catalyst for change. Civil rights organizations cited the case as a model for how community engagement and documented evidence could lead to meaningful reform. Mrs. Carter's live stream had accumulated over 1 million views, but she considered her most important contribution to be the weekly community dialogue sessions she now hosted with Mrs. Johnson. These meetings brought together residents, police officers, and city officials for honest conversations about building trust and understanding. The Johnson children showed remarkable resilience. The oldest son's video documentation of the incident had earned him an unexpected reputation as a citizen journalist. He started a school club teaching digital citizenship and the responsible use of technology for social justice. His younger siblings found their own ways to process and grow from the experience. Mrs. Johnson's youngest daughter, who had once been terrified of police officers, found healing through art therapy. Her drawings evolved from frightening scenes of that Sunday afternoon to hopeful visions of community unity. The local children's museum asked to display her artwork as part of an exhibition on seeing through children's eyes. The reforms began showing results sooner than expected. Traffic stop data revealed significant changes in racial disparity statistics. Community complaints decreased while positive interactions increased. Officers who had initially resisted the changes began to embrace the new approach as they experienced improved relationships with residents. Local businesses joined the transformation effort. The coffee shop near Mrs. Johnson's school started hosting monthly Coffee with a Cop events, creating casual opportunities for officers and residents to interact. These simple conversations helped break down barriers and build mutual understanding. Mrs. Johnson returned to her role on the Police Oversight Committee, now with a deeper perspective on its importance. Her experience added weight to her recommendations, and her continued willingness to engage with the department despite her trauma earned respect from all sides. She worked closely with Lieutenant Thompson to develop training programs that emphasized empathy and cultural awareness. The City Council recognized the need for institutional support. They increased funding for community policing initiatives and approved the creation of a permanent civilian advisory board. Mrs. Johnson's case had demonstrated the value of having diverse community voices involved in law enforcement oversight. 1 year after the incident, the Johnson family organized a community celebration of change. The event wasn't about dwelling on past trauma but celebrating progress and recommitting to the work ahead. Officers and residents shared meals, children played together, and people exchanged stories of how the past year had transformed their perspectives. Mrs. Johnson's approach to healing became a model for others facing similar situations. Rather than letting anger consume her, she had channeled her experience into positive action. Support groups formed, inspired by her example, helping other families process their encounters with law enforcement and advocate for change. The school district incorporated lessons from Mrs. Johnson's case into their curriculum. Students learned about civic engagement, peaceful advocacy, and the power of documentation in the digital age. These practical lessons empowered young people to become active participants in their community's development. The youngest Johnson child, once afraid to walk past the police station, now proudly led her Girl Scout troop on educational visits there. The department's community outreach officer, a former student of Mrs. Johnson's, made sure each visit included positive interactions and age-appropriate discussions about community safety. As more departments adopted similar reforms, Mrs. Johnson was invited to speak at police academies and community forums across the country. Her message remained consistent: true safety comes from mutual respect, understanding, and accountability. Her family's story became a powerful testament to the possibility of transforming painful experiences into positive change. The case had lasting effects on police recruitment and training. Candidates now underwent more rigorous screening for bias, and training emphasized de-escalation and community engagement. The department's motto changed to Protect, Serve, and Connect, reflecting their renewed commitment to building community trust. Looking back on that Sunday afternoon that changed their lives, the Johnson family could see how their pain had sparked a movement for positive change. Their story demonstrated that accountability and reform were possible when communities united, evidence was preserved, and people committed to transforming systems rather than simply punishing individuals. 18 months after that fateful Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Johnson stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a national conference on community policing. Her children sat in the front row, beaming with pride as their mother shared their family's journey from trauma to transformation. The room fell silent as she spoke, her quiet strength carrying more impact than any shouted slogan. Change doesn't always come from the top down, she explained, showing slides of her community's transformation. Sometimes it grows from the ground up, from everyday people deciding to turn pain into purpose. The audience included police chiefs, civil rights leaders, and community organizers from across the country, all taking notes on what had become known as the Johnson model of police community reform. Back home, their city had become a case study in successful transformation. The police department's new training program, developed with input from Mrs. Johnson and other community leaders, had become a national model. Officers now spent time in local schools not as authority figures, but as community partners, building relationships with young people and their families. Mrs. Johnson's eldest son had turned his experience into a youth empowerment program. Working with tech-savvy teens, he taught digital citizenship and responsible documentation skills. Knowledge is power, he told his young participants, but how we use that power matters. His program had spread to neighboring cities, with support from civil rights organizations and technology companies. The middle child, once hesitant to speak about their experience, found his voice through writing. His essay about that day and its aftermath won a National Youth Journalism Award. More importantly, it helped other young people process their own encounters with law enforcement and inspired them to become advocates for change. The youngest Johnson child's art therapy journey sparked a new program in local schools. Drawing through difficulty helped children process challenging experiences through creative expression. Her original superhero drawing of her mother now hung in the police academy's new community engagement wing, a powerful reminder of how their actions affected families. Lieutenant Thompson's courage in speaking up had created a ripple effect within law enforcement. Other officers, inspired by his example, began reporting misconduct and suggesting improvements. The blue wall of silence showed cracks as more officers recognized that true loyalty meant holding each other accountable. Mrs. Carter's community dialogue sessions had evolved into a regular television program on the local public access channel. Neighborhood Voices brought together diverse perspectives for honest conversations about community safety and relationships with law enforcement. The show's success led to similar programs in other cities. The Civilian Review Board's decision in Mrs. Johnson's case set legal precedents that influenced departments nationwide. Their detailed findings and reform recommendations became a blueprint for other communities seeking to improve police accountability. Law schools began using the case in their curriculum, examining how community engagement and documentation could drive systemic change. Mrs. Johnson's fourth-grade classroom continued to be a laboratory for positive change. Her students learned about civic responsibility through real-world examples, understanding that even young people could contribute to community improvement. Many of her former students now pursued careers in public service, inspired by her example of turning challenge into opportunity. The police department's transformation faced its share of challenges. Some officers initially resisted the changes, viewing increased oversight as a threat. But as community relations improved and job satisfaction rose, even skeptics began to embrace the new approach. Crime rates dropped as trust grew, demonstrating that accountability and effectiveness could go hand in hand. The Coffee with a Cop program expanded to include monthly family dinners, where officers and residents shared meals and conversations in local homes. These informal gatherings broke down barriers and humanized both sides, making it harder to maintain stereotypes and prejudices. The Johnson family hosted the first dinner, turning their initial trauma into an opportunity for healing. Local businesses noticed positive changes too. As community police relations improved, shop owners reported feeling safer while needing to call law enforcement less frequently. The Chamber of Commerce created a Community Unity Award, with Mrs. Johnson as its first recipient, recognizing individuals who strengthened neighborhood bonds. The city's annual budget reflected the transformation. Funds previously spent on military-style equipment were redirected to community programs, mental health resources, and officer training. The police chief, once skeptical of such changes, became their strongest advocate after seeing the positive results in officer morale and community safety. Mrs. Johnson's role on the Police Oversight Committee expanded to include training new officers. She shared her story not to shame but to educate, helping recruits understand the long-lasting impact of their actions on families and communities. Many officers later cited her sessions as transformative moments in their training. The Johnson Children's School experiences improved dramatically. Teachers noted increased engagement and confidence, particularly in discussions about citizenship and justice. Their example inspired other students to become more involved in community issues, creating a new generation of informed and active citizens. National media attention brought both opportunities and challenges. While Mrs. Johnson appreciated the platform for sharing their message of transformation, she remained focused on local impact. Real change happens person by person, block by block, she often reminded journalists who sought sensational angles on their story. The case's legal implications continued to evolve. Law firms cited the Johnson precedent in similar cases nationwide, while police departments proactively implemented reforms to avoid similar incidents. The combination of clear evidence, community engagement, and systematic follow-through created a model for meaningful change. Looking toward the future, Mrs. Johnson saw hope in unexpected places. Young police recruits sought her advice, community leaders replicated her programs, and families shared stories of positive encounters with law enforcement. The transformation wasn't complete, but the foundation for lasting change had been laid. Their family's journey had shown that even the most painful experiences could lead to positive change when met with courage, dignity, and community support. As Mrs. Johnson often told her students, our choices in difficult moments define not just who we are, but who we can become. Their story had become more than a cautionary tale, it was a roadmap for communities seeking to build trust, accountability, and mutual respect. 2 years had passed since that transformative Sunday afternoon. On a bright morning, Mrs. Johnson walked through the doors of a newly established Community Justice Center, a facility that hadn't existed before her family's experience. The building stood as a physical testament to change, housing programs that bridged the gap between law enforcement and the community they served. Inside her fourth-grade classroom, things had changed too. Her students now participated in a pioneering program called Future Leaders, which brought police officers into classrooms as mentors rather than authority figures. The same hallways where she had once taught routine lessons now echoed with meaningful discussions about citizenship, justice, and community responsibility. The Johnson children had grown tremendously through their experience. The eldest, now preparing for college, had been accepted to several prestigious universities based partly on his work in community advocacy and digital citizenship. His youth empowerment program had expanded to 30 schools across 3 states, teaching young people how to document, report, and advocate for change responsibly. Mrs. Johnson's middle child had found his calling in journalism, running a successful school newspaper that covered community issues with remarkable maturity. His balanced reporting on police-community relations earned recognition from local media outlets, who often cited his unique perspective as both a witness to injustice and an advocate for constructive change. The youngest Johnson child's art therapy program had blossomed into a citywide initiative. Her original superhero drawing of her mother had inspired a series of children's books about community heroes, written and illustrated by local students. The books were now used in elementary schools to teach young children about civic engagement and peaceful conflict resolution. Lieutenant Thompson had been promoted to captain and now headed the department's Community Relations Division. Under his leadership, the department had become a national model for progressive policing. Officers received ongoing training in cultural competency, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement, with Mrs. Johnson regularly contributing her insights as a consultant. The Civilian Review Board had evolved into a more powerful entity, with increased authority and resources. Their successful handling of the Johnson case led to expanded responsibilities, including input on police training, policy development, and community programs. Other cities frequently consulted them when establishing their own oversight mechanisms. Mrs. Carter's Neighborhood Voices program had gone national, with similar shows appearing in cities across the country. The format remained simple but powerful, bringing together diverse community members for honest conversations about safety, justice, and mutual understanding. Mrs. Johnson appeared as a regular guest, sharing updates on ongoing reforms and new initiatives. The police department's transformation continued to yield positive results. Officer retention improved as job satisfaction increased, and recruitment attracted more diverse candidates who shared the department's new community-oriented vision. The us versus them mentality that had once dominated police culture was gradually replaced by a spirit of partnership and shared responsibility. Local businesses had become active partners in community policing efforts. The Coffee with a Cop program expanded into a broader business alliance, where shop owners worked closely with officers to address neighborhood concerns through collaboration rather than confrontation. The program's success attracted attention from chambers of commerce nationwide. The Johnson family's home remained a gathering place for community leaders, but the conversations had evolved. Instead of focusing solely on police reform, they now discussed broader issues of social justice, education, and community development. Their living room had become an incubator for ideas that would shape the next phase of their community's growth. Mrs. Johnson's role had grown. Beyond her original positions as teacher and oversight committee member, she now conducted training sessions for police departments across the country, always emphasizing the human impact of law enforcement actions. Her approach, combining personal experience with practical solutions, resonated with officers and community members alike. The city's annual Unity Festival, born from the aftermath of the Johnson incident, had become a cherished tradition. Police officers and residents collaborated on everything from planning to cleanup, building relationships through shared responsibility. The event symbolized how far they'd come while acknowledging the ongoing work needed to maintain progress. Education remained at the heart of their efforts. The school district's curriculum now included grade-appropriate lessons on civil rights, community engagement, and digital citizenship. Teachers reported increased student interest in civic participation, with many young people inspired by the Johnson family's example of turning adversity into positive change. Legal reforms inspired by the case continued to spread. State legislators used elements of the Johnson model when crafting new laws on police accountability and community oversight. The combination of clear evidence, community engagement, and systematic follow-through had proven effective in creating lasting change. The youngest Johnson child, once traumatized by the sight of a police uniform, now led tours of the police academy for her peers. Her natural ability to bridge divides made her an effective ambassador for the department's youth outreach programs. Officers often remarked how her presence reminded them of the importance of building trust with the community's youngest members. As other communities faced similar challenges, Mrs. Johnson's phone would ring with calls from activists, police chiefs, and civic leaders seeking advice. She always emphasized the importance of working within the system while pushing for change, maintaining dignity in the face of injustice, and focusing on long-term transformation rather than short-term reactions. The family's story became part of the official training curriculum at police academies across the state. New recruits watched video interviews with the Johnson family, understanding how a single traffic stop could impact not just one family but an entire community. The training emphasized the ripple effects of every police interaction. Looking ahead, Mrs. Johnson saw both progress and challenges. While their community had made significant strides, she knew that maintaining positive change required ongoing commitment from all sides. She often reminded her students that progress wasn't a destination but a journey, requiring vigilance and dedication from each new generation. The legacy of that Sunday afternoon continued to evolve. What began as a traumatic encounter had transformed into a movement for positive change, touching lives far beyond their immediate community. The Johnson family's experience showed that when people chose hope over hate, dignity over despair, and unity over division, real transformation was possible. 3 years after the incident that changed their lives, the Johnson family gathered in their backyard for a community celebration. The occasion was bittersweet. Mrs. Johnson's eldest son was leaving for college, where he planned to study law and civil rights. The gathering included faces that would have seemed unlikely 3 years ago: police officers chatting with neighbors, community leaders sharing stories with new recruits, and children playing without fear. The Community Justice Center, now a bustling hub of activity, had become a model for cities nationwide. Visitors came from across the country to study how a traumatic incident had transformed into a catalyst for positive change. The center's walls displayed a timeline of their journey, starting with Mrs. Carter's live stream and continuing through each milestone of transformation. Mrs. Johnson's classroom had evolved into a learning lab for community engagement. Teachers from other districts observed her methods, learning how to integrate civic responsibility and social justice into their daily lessons. Her students, now including children of police officers, demonstrated how early exposure to honest dialogue could break down generational barriers. The middle Johnson child had expanded his journalism work into a youth media network, connecting young reporters across the city. Their coverage of community issues brought fresh perspectives to local news, highlighting both progress and ongoing challenges in police-community relations. His original essay about that Sunday afternoon was now part of journalism courses in several universities. The youngest Johnson child's art therapy program had spawned a nationwide movement. Drawing through difficulty, centers opened in cities facing similar challenges, helping children process their experiences through creative expression. Her superhero drawing of her mother had inspired a series of murals across the city, each depicting everyday heroes working for positive change. Captain Thompson, formerly lieutenant, had been appointed as the city's new police chief. His appointment symbolized the department's commitment to reform, with the selection committee citing his courage in speaking up during the Johnson incident as evidence of his character. Under his leadership, the department's community-first approach had become deeply ingrained in its culture. The Civilian Review Board's expanded model had been adopted by cities in 12 states. Their comprehensive approach to oversight, combining community input with professional expertise, proved effective in preventing incidents while addressing concerns when they arose. Mrs. Johnson continued serving on the board, her experience informing their evolving practices. Mrs. Carter's Community Dialogue program had spawned a network of similar initiatives nationwide. The simple concept of bringing people together for honest conversations had proven powerful in building understanding across divides. The program's success challenged the notion that community police relations were inherently adversarial. The Police Academy's training program, now including extensive community engagement components, attracted recruits who shared the department's reformed vision. Officers who had initially resisted changes became some of their strongest advocates, having experienced the benefits of improved community relations firsthand. The department's turnover rate dropped significantly as job satisfaction increased. Local businesses had transformed from passive observers to active participants in community policing. The business alliance created after the Johnson incident now offered internships for young people interested in law enforcement, creating pathways for diverse candidates to enter the field. Shop owners reported feeling safer while rarely needing to call for police intervention. The Johnson family home remained a gathering place, but the conversations had evolved. Instead of focusing on past trauma, discussions centered on future opportunities, new programs to launch, relationships to build, and barriers yet to break down. Their experience had shown that sustainable change required ongoing commitment from all community members. Mrs. Johnson's influence extended far beyond her original roles. She had become a sought-after speaker at police academies, universities, and community organizations nationwide. Her message remained consistent: true security comes from mutual respect, understanding, and accountability. Her family's story offered hope to communities facing similar challenges. The city's Unity Festival had grown into a regional event, drawing participants from neighboring communities eager to learn from their example. The festival's planning committee, consisting of equal numbers of police officers and community members, demonstrated how collaborative leadership could strengthen neighborhood bonds. Education continued driving positive change. The school district's expanded curriculum now included programs on conflict resolution, cultural understanding, and responsible citizenship. Students who had witnessed the community's transformation became passionate advocates for justice, carrying these lessons into their future careers. Legal reforms inspired by the Johnson case had sparked a national conversation about police accountability and community oversight. Legislators and law enforcement leaders studied their model, recognizing that meaningful change required both policy updates and cultural transformation. The case's impact on legal precedent continued growing as other communities adapted its principles. The youngest Johnson child, now in middle school, had started a peer mentoring program connecting students with police officers' children. Their shared experiences helped bridge divides that had once seemed insurmountable. The program's success highlighted how younger generations could lead the way in building trust and understanding. As other cities faced similar challenges, the Johnson family's story offered a roadmap for positive change. Their experience demonstrated that transformation required more than policy updates; it needed committed individuals willing to work together across traditional divides. The Johnson model became shorthand for comprehensive community police reform. Looking toward the future, Mrs. Johnson remained optimistic but realistic. While their community had made significant progress, she understood that maintaining positive change required constant attention and renewal. Each new generation needed to learn these lessons anew, finding their own ways to build upon the foundation laid by their predecessors. The legacy of that Sunday afternoon continued growing in unexpected ways. What began as a traumatic encounter had blossomed into a movement for positive change, touching lives far beyond their immediate community. The Johnson family's journey showed that when people chose collaboration over confrontation, understanding over assumption, and hope over fear, lasting transformation was possible. As the backyard celebration wound down, Mrs. Johnson watched her children interact with the diverse gathering. Her eldest discussed his college plans with a senior officer who had offered to mentor him. Her middle child interviewed community leaders for his final local news piece before launching his college journalism project. Her youngest showed her latest artwork to a group of academy recruits, explaining how art could build bridges between communities. Their story had no neat ending because the work of building and maintaining trust never truly ended. Instead, it offered hope that with courage, dignity, and community support, even the most challenging situations could become catalysts for positive change. The Johnson family's experience showed that true transformation happened not through grand gestures but through daily choices to work together toward a better future.